Hello, it's Ryan from 2MinuteTennis.net, and in this video, I'm going to compare the backhands of Berrettini and Djokovic. Now, these videos are courtesy of 12KGP Tennis on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to their awesome channel. I'll put their link in the description below. Now, both of these players obviously have amazing backhands, but when it comes down to it, I'm going to show you why you should be copying Djokovic's backhand, and I'm going to show you three main differences. The first one is going to be the turn. So there is a slight technical difference between what they both do. Let's look at Berrettini first. When Berrettini takes his racket back, there is a slight little move that he makes. And it's right here. Let me zoom in as far as I can. See that move right there with his racket? I want you to notice that his racket angle becomes from here and it goes like this. Watch how his racket becomes more closed and that his strings are pointing down a little bit. Now, I'm not really saying that that's wrong, but it definitely will hurt your consistency, and I'll show you why. So this is actually an accelerant, and this is actually along the lines of the lag on the forehand, where when you watch Berrettini, as he drops the racket, he actually has a lag on his backhand. And you used to see Roddick do the same thing here. He takes his racket back, and then that little tilt, you can see him tilt the racket ever so slightly, tilting the strings down, which means as the racket falls, it's going to have to lag back to get into the slot, into this position right here. I want you to watch Djokovic. Watch how there's no tilting of the strings down, but rather his strings are facing straight off to his side. And he has this beautiful drop where the racket basically falls like the letter C. So it's very much C-like when his racket drops. And so he doesn't drop down. You can see Berrettini drops down and then goes back at an angle, where Djokovic goes back and kind of arcs it. So watch Berrettini goes down and then pulls back, and I'll demonstrate this in front of the camera. He goes down and then back. That is kind of the backhand's version of tap the dog, where here Djokovic, because his strings are facing off to the side, he just has a beautiful drop that is circular to get into that closed position. So they both get into a similar position. But, and you can see they both have their strings pointing down, which is vital to getting the strings to face forward at contact. But with Berrettini, he has a lot more stretch in his forearms. And that's because the racket head was being thrown back. When the racket head gets thrown back as the hands are going forward, it's that move right there. It produces a stretch in the forearms that typically will show later on in the swing, and you can see this. So let's look at his finish. Notice how his racket is slightly closed now. So his strings are pointing down, and with the strings pointing down like this, you can see how low his right elbow is. So you can see the low elbow and his strings are actually pointing down. This is what I call the right side of the letter V. So he's got the letter V here, and his racket is making the right side with his strings pointing down. But when we watch Djokovic, because he didn't pre-stretch the forearms, and he's not going to snap the racket as much as Berrettini, watch how he keeps the racket to the left of his hands. And so this is called the left side of the letter V. His strings, when he's done, are actually pointing up. You can see how much higher his right elbow is. That means he's lifting from the shoulders and not snapping from his elbow, where you can see Berrettini's elbow is much lower. Now you might say, well, maybe Berrettini's hitting cross court. No, Berrettini's just hitting low down the middle, where you watch Djokovic and he's actually hitting this ball low cross court. And he's just ripping it cross court to Marin Cilic over there. So this technique that Djokovic is using, you can use for down the line or cross court, and it's super consistent. So let me show you this in front of the camera. Now, to help me demonstrate these two backhand techniques, I've got the Topspin Pro here. You know what to do. Grab my affiliate link in the description below, and I'll pin it in the first comment. It would mean the world to me if you used my link to get the Topspin Pro for at-home practice. So thank you so much. All right. What these three differences, I was so excited to make this video and show you this. When Berrettini turns, and we saw this with Roddick a little bit 20 years ago, is when Berrettini turns, he does this. And this little move is similar to what you'll see Nadal do when the racket drops and that little, pat the dog, and then you make that move. So anytime the racket makes this move, as the racket drops, it's then going to have to snap back. So when the hands go forward and the racket snaps back, that pre-stretches both forearms, and it kind of makes the racket slingshot back to get to contact. that can be a little dangerous. I mean, maybe not for Berrettini, but for normal players like myself and maybe for you who's watching this, when we make this little move, it can then lead to the racket face changing too quickly as we're striking the ball. So it can be a little hard to control where we're going to hit the ball. And this is shown in his finish. So Berrettini takes it back, he tilts it slightly, then as the racket drops, he starts to turn the hips, that snaps the racket back. And when you see Berrettini when he's done, his strings point down and he has a low right elbow, which is going to be all caused by this, by the way. Typically what happens after contact is caused before contact, right? So you don't want to, for all you coaches and for you players who are trying to work on your game, don't just work on the finish, because the finish is a byproduct of what you were doing prior to the hit. When you watch Djokovic though, Djokovic turns and he does the perfect, what's called point your strings to the crowd, which means there's a crowd of people, to his left. And when he turns, the strings are facing directly to the left. You could put a coin on the edge of his racket. So when Djokovic drops, he drops in a more conventional circular motion where the racket's on edge and then the racket drops to this slot position. Remember, Berrettini was here and he dropped slightly and then snapped it back. Djokovic is more on edge and then just drops in a little C to here. That means he hasn't preloaded the forearms with that pre-stretch that you'll think about when it comes to the lag forehand of the forehand and the Berrettini backhand. So now when Djokovic goes through, he can keep his wrist angles the same. And that's what we saw with that backhand. He hit that backhand and he kept the strings to the left of his hands. Now, some people are going to say, well, you cherry-picked the Djokovic backhand. Well, a little bit. I would say about 70% of the time, Djokovic keeps the racket to the left side of the letter V. So did I have to go very far? No, I would say about 7 out of 10 backhands he uses the left side. And the other 3 out of 10, his racket is straight up and down. You're really not going to find Djokovic in this position much at all. You'd have to, that would be cherry-picking to find a video like that. So when the racket drops, for Djokovic, he then just turns and he keeps the racket to the left of his hands, keeping this wrist position intact rather than snapping it with a low elbow. And he just lifts with his shoulders so that the elbows are high. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to copy anyone's backhand, all points bulletin. What a shock, right? I would say the Djokovic backhand. So when you turn, film yourself. Have your racket straight up and down. Don't have it tilted closed. Now, I will say this. When you are someone who turns this way, for myself, I, as a coach, will tell people to have their racket slightly closed in order to get their racket square. So my job as a coach isn't always to be right, but it's to be helpful. That's the whole point of coaching, right? Is to be helpful. So when you turn, if you're someone who tends to turn with your racket wide open, and then that turns into having to snap the forearms and just causes all sorts of problems, what I would recommend is that you feel as if your strings are slightly closed, but when you film yourself, you'll probably notice that your strings are facing off to the side. Then drop and keep the racket to the left of your hands if you are right-handed. I'm going to demonstrate this lefty. I got some people in the comments going, where are the videos for lefties? So I'm going to do this for a lefty as best I can. So I've got the grip change. I'm going to turn. There's the racket straight up and down. Berrettini was like this. When the racket drops, it should just drop in the back where it's circular. The racket head draws a circular move. That gets you inside, so you can go what's called inside out, and you can swing away from the body. Strings are closed so that when I get to the ball, my strings are facing forward. Now, as a lefty, hitting on the right side of your body, the racket has to be to the right of your hands. And then when you finish, have your elbows up just to make sure that you swung up with your shoulders. Grab a Topspin Pro. You know what to do. Affiliate link in the description below. But here's the key. You have to film yourself. If you're not filming yourself hitting serves, backhands, forehands, volleys, if you're not filming your matches, how do you know what you're actually doing? I'm putting out all this content so that you can take the info, compare what you're learning here on 2 Minute Tennis to what you're seeing with your own videos, and you can become your own coach. Copy the Novak Djokovic backhand technique, and there's no doubt you're going to gain confidence, win more matches, and play much better tennis. This is Ryan Reedy from 2minutetennis.net. You got this.